This is Command Post, a series of discussions about military matters from Time and the Center for a New American Security.
Dr. Ritchie, until recently, you were the Army's top psychiatrist. In the last 5 years, Army suicide rate has doubled. Why is this happening, and what is the service doing about it?
What we find when we look at the suicides is that they're really happening in units that have been deployed over and over. So part of the phenomenon is something we call the high op tempo, where the leadership of the unit will complain that they really don't know their soldiers, service members, the same way that they used to. When you look at the suicides, a third have never deployed. So clearly it's not about individual deployments for them, but I really believe that it's about the unit deployment tempo. The Army did a task force, the Department of Defense has done a task force. They have tried and trying everything that they can think of, but nonetheless it continues to be a very difficult problem. We are leveling off the suicide rate in the active duty, but in the National Guard and the Reserve, it's continuing to rise.
And is that because the Guard and the Reserves are basically more isolated when they come back home? They don't have the support of a big post with all of its mental health facilities, and when they go back to their communities across the country?
That's certainly part of it. Another part is they may have had a really good, exciting job in the military, and with this economy, when they come back, they may be returning to no work or a job that they really don't feel is the same as it was when they were in the military, and the feeling that the people out in my hometown, they don't understand me, the feeling about being isolated. That's why it's so important for communities to reach out to the Guard and Reserve as they're coming back home.
Dr. Harrell, you recently did a policy paper on suicide. Is it fair to say the military is having a suicide epidemic?
It has doubled in the last 5 years in the
For the
United States Army. And so if not an epidemic, it is certainly a growing problem.
I think it's fair to say it's a growing problem. As Dr. Ritchie noted, especially in the Guard and Reserve, it's an increasing problem. And one of the real problems for Guardsmen and Reservists is that they have fewer resources available to them. If they're not activated, they don't have access to the same military programs. And especially in the case of the Guard, we see state-by-state programs being defunded in this time of reduced state resources.
Isn't it fair to point out, though, about the Guard, because I've looked into it to some degree, that a lot of times the big Army doesn't know if a Guardsman has killed himself. The connectivity between the individual Guardsman and the Army writ large isn't very good, and they don't have an accurate barometer of that. Fair statement, not a fair statement?
Well, it's much better than it used to be. So 5, 6 years ago, we really had very little idea if a Guardsman or reservist suicided. In the last 5 years, under the leadership of the Vice Chief of Staff and others, there's been a tremendous effort to get their arms around the numbers and the data. But you're right, in some cases we don't know.
And there's also a time lag problem, I believe.
Absolutely, there is.
And that makes this analysis that we're trying to do a whole lot harder, because different states have different reporting requirements and different timelines. So it's hard for people like you two to get the data that's required to make good policy recommendations.
I think it's hard to get the data on Guard and Reserve suicides. I think, though, we can make policy recommendations because we know the rates of suicide are going up. And there have been a lot of programs that have started up to try to reintegrate veterans, Guard, Reserve back into the community. One of the problems, though, is it's still kind of a patchwork. Different states will have different programs, and if you're at the other end of a TV screen or a computer screen at 2 in the morning and you're feeling isolated and lost, you may not know how or who to talk to.
Is it fair to say that when these wars go away and when they wind down, the suicide rate will come back down? Or is this a sort of problem that sort of persists beneath the surface and we may be left with a hangover of suicides for years to come?
I think it's fair to presume that this problem is going to persist for a while, and that we will have a more difficult time understanding the extent of the problem. And as the wars phase out and the military sizes down, we'll have more individuals that are veterans but not by their own choosing. They may or may not have employment, and we'll have less opportunity to watch them, to help them, and to count them if, unfortunately, they do turn up as suicide victims.
This clearly will be a persistent problem. And it's not just suicide, of course, it's post-traumatic stress disorder, it's pain, it may be traumatic brain injury, so there can be a combination of factors. Often they really don't want mental health treatment, and if you offer it, they may or may not go, but boy, they want a job.